In this video, we dive deep into the current decline of Western power and influence, discussing how the once dominant economies of the United States and Europe are faltering under the weight of debt, inflation, and deindustrialization. We explore how the West's reliance on sanctions has backfired, isolating themselves instead of their targets, and fueling the rise of a multipolar world. Nations like Russia, China, and many others are forming new alliances and economic systems, bypassing the dollar and Western influence altogether. From failed democracy promotion to weakening alliances, we reveal why the West is losing its grip on global leadership. This video covers media, political leaders at a summit, protesters with flags, empty government buildings, political debates. The collapse of Western economies, mounting debt, inflation, and industrial decline. Why Western sanctions against Russia, Iran, and other countries are no longer effective. The global rise of BRICS and the push for de-dollarization. How Western foreign policy has isolated itself rather than its adversaries. The cultural and geopolitical shifts leading to a new global order. The domestic political turmoil in the West and the rise of populism. If you're interested in global geopolitics, economic trends, and understanding the decline of Western dominance, this video is for you. Stay informed and get the full picture of how the West is losing its global influence. Watch the full analysis and share your thoughts in the comments. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more insightful content. Let's start with today's topic. The decline of Western hegemony. How the West is becoming the laughingstock of the world. The West, particularly the United States and Western Europe, once stood as towering figures of economic dominance, political influence, and military strength. Their liberal democracies were perceived as models to emulate, and their control over global financial institutions made them the de facto leaders of the world order. However, in recent years, cracks have begun to appear in this Western edifice, making the once mighty powers the subject of ridicule on the global stage. The narrative of Western superiority is being questioned more aggressively, and the once all-powerful West now finds itself struggling to maintain its influence. This piece delves deeply into how Western economies are faltering, how their sanctions are backfiring, and how they've become increasingly isolated in a multipolar world where the rest of the world is flourishing by ignoring or outright defying Western dictates. The collapsing Western economy from growth to stagnation. The Western economies, particularly the United States and Europe, were once seen as the engines of global economic growth. But today, they are mired in stagnation, massive debt, and inflationary pressures that reveal the fragile foundations of their prosperity. Mounting debt crisis. One of the most glaring signs of the West's economic decline is its spiraling debt. The United States, for instance, has a national debt exceeding $33 trillion, which amounts to more than 100% of its GDP. The European Union isn't far behind, with countries like Italy and Spain grappling with unsustainable debt levels. These mounting debts are not just numbers on a balance sheet. They represent the West's inability to control its public finances, driven by years of military spending, welfare programs, and unproductive investments. Western governments are trapped in a vicious cycle. They must borrow more money to pay off existing debt, leading to further indebtedness. This erodes confidence in their currencies and financial systems. The United States' excessive reliance on the dollar's reserve currency status has led to reckless money printing, resulting in inflation that is eroding the purchasing power of average Americans. Europe, with its over-regulated economies and expensive welfare systems, is similarly unable to ignite sustained growth. Inflation and income inequality. The Western economies are also grappling with surging inflation. The United States, in particular, has seen inflation rise to multi-decade highs in recent years, driven by supply chain disruptions, excessive stimulus measures during the pandemic, and rising energy costs. This has left households struggling to afford basic necessities, while wages have failed to keep pace with the rising cost of living. The middle class, the backbone of Western economies, is shrinking, while wealth inequality is reaching unprecedented levels. A small elite of billionaires has amassed vast fortunes, while ordinary citizens are drowning in debt and stagnant wages. The vaunted American dream is rapidly becoming a distant memory for millions of Americans who are burdened by student loans, exorbitant healthcare costs, and the lack of affordable housing. Deindustrialization and outsourcing. Another key factor contributing to the collapse of Western economies is deindustrialization. Over the past few decades, many Western countries, particularly the United States, have outsourced large parts of their manufacturing base to countries like China and India, where labor is cheaper. This hollowing out of domestic industries has led to job losses and a decline in the economic dynamism that once characterized Western economies. In the quest for higher profits, Western corporations have dismantled their own industries, transferring intellectual property, technical expertise, and manufacturing capabilities to rising economies. China, in particular, has become the world's factory, capitalizing on Western greed and short-sightedness. Now, Western economies find themselves dependent on foreign imports for essential goods, from electronics to pharmaceuticals, leaving them vulnerable to supply chain disruptions and geopolitical tensions. Energy crisis and dependency. The West's energy policies have been equally self-defeating. Europe's over-reliance on Russian energy, particularly natural gas, left it exposed when geopolitical tensions escalated, leading to an energy crisis that has crippled its industries and households. The ill-conceived push for green energy without adequate alternatives has further exacerbated the problem, with countries like Germany facing blackouts and soaring energy costs. Meanwhile, countries in Asia, Africa, and Latin America are diversifying their energy sources, striking deals with both Western and non-Western energy producers. The West, in contrast, is scrambling to secure energy supplies, resorting to desperate measures like rationing and price controls. The transition to renewable energy, while laudable in principle, has been haphazard and poorly planned, leading to economic disruption and political unrest. Western sanctions, the boomerang effect. Sanctions were once considered a powerful weapon in the Western arsenal, used to coerce countries into compliance with its geopolitical objectives. However, in recent years, the effectiveness of Western sanctions has waned, and in many cases, they have backfired, isolating the West itself rather than their intended targets. Russia and the failure of sanctions. Perhaps the most glaring example of the West's failed sanctions strategy is Russia. After the annexation of Crimea in 2014 and, more recently, the invasion of Ukraine in 2022, the United States and its European allies unleashed a barrage of sanctions on Russia aimed at crippling its economy. However, instead of bringing Russia to its knees, the sanctions have had the opposite effect. Russia, with its vast reserves of natural resources, has weathered the sanctions far better than expected. The Russian ruble, though initially battered, has stabilized, and Moscow has found new markets for its oil and gas in Asia, particularly in China and India. Western attempts to impose price caps on Russian oil have been openly flouted by these nations, demonstrating the waning influence of the West. Moreover, Russia has deepened its economic ties with non-Western countries, creating new trade routes and supply chains that bypass Western financial systems. The rise of alternative financial mechanisms like the BRICS nations' exploration of a new reserve currency is further weakening the West's ability to dictate global economic policy. The Iran sanctions debacle. Iran is another example of how Western sanctions have backfired. For decades, the United States has imposed crippling sanctions on Iran in an attempt to force the country to abandon its nuclear program. Yet, rather than achieving compliance, the sanctions have only strengthened Iran's resolve and pushed it into the arms of new allies, particularly China and Russia. Iran has continued to develop its nuclear capabilities while expanding its influence in the Middle East. By isolating Iran economically, the West has inadvertently accelerated the formation of a new axis of cooperation between Tehran, Beijing, and Moscow. These countries are now coordinating more closely on trade, military cooperation, and diplomatic efforts, further eroding the West's influence in the region. One of the most significant unintended consequences of Western sanctions has been the accelerated push for de-dollarization. The weaponization of the dollar through sanctions has made countries around the world wary of relying on the US financial system. As a result, many nations are seeking alternatives to the dollar in international trade. Russia and China, for example, are increasingly conducting trade in their own currencies, bypassing the dollar altogether. The creation of alternative payment systems, such as China's Cross-Border Interbank Payment System, CIPS, is further eroding the dominance of the SWIFT system, which the West has long used to enforce its sanctions. Countries in Africa, Latin America, and Asia are also exploring the use of digital currencies and local currencies for trade, reducing their dependence on the dollar. This trend poses a significant threat to the United States' ability to project power through its control of the global financial system. As the world moves towards a multipolar currency system, the West's leverage is diminishing rapidly. As the West's economic and political influence wanes, it is increasingly finding itself isolated on the world stage. This isolation is not just a consequence of its failed economic policies and sanctions. It is also the result of its inability to adapt to a rapidly changing geopolitical landscape. One of the most significant shifts in global power dynamics in recent years has been the rise of a multipolar world. For decades, the West enjoyed unchallenged dominance, but today, new centers of power are emerging. China, Russia, India, and other rising powers are asserting their influence, creating new alliances and institutions that challenge the West's monopoly on global governance. The BRICS bloc, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, is a prime example of this shift. The group has expanded its economic cooperation and is working towards creating a new reserve currency to reduce its reliance on the dollar. Other regional organizations, such as the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, SCO, and the Eurasian Economic Union, EAEU, are also gaining influence, providing alternatives to Western-dominated institutions like the World Bank and the IMF. As the West clings to its outdated notions of supremacy, the rest of the world is moving on, forging new partnerships and trade routes that exclude the United States and Europe. The West's attempts to maintain control through sanctions, military interventions, and diplomatic pressure are increasingly ineffective in this new multipolar environment. The West's isolation is not just economic and political, it is also cultural. For much of the 20th century, Western culture, Hollywood movies, pop music, fashion, was a dominant force that shaped global tastes and aspirations. However, in recent years, Western soft power has been in decline. Countries around the world are increasingly rejecting Western cultural values, which are often seen as arrogant and out of touch with the realities of their own societies. The Western narrative of liberal democracy, human rights, and individualism is losing its appeal as countries in Asia, Africa, and Latin America develop their own models of governance and culture that are better suited to their historical contexts and values. For decades, the United States and its European allies have pushed their model of liberal democracy as the ideal form of government, often through interventions and nation-building efforts in places like Iraq, Afghanistan, and Libya. However, these efforts have largely ended in failure, leaving behind chaos, civil war, and failed states. The West's hypocrisy in promoting democracy has also been exposed. While preaching the values of freedom and human rights, Western countries have supported authoritarian regimes when it suits their geopolitical interests. This selective application of democratic principles has undermined the credibility of the West's ideological message. Countries in the Global South, in particular, are increasingly skeptical of Western claims to moral superiority. Meanwhile, countries like China and Russia are presenting alternative governance models that emphasize stability, economic development, and national sovereignty over the West's model of liberal democracy. These alternatives are gaining traction in many parts of the world, as they offer a path to development without the political upheaval and economic exploitation that often accompanies Western-style democratic transitions. Another factor contributing to the West's isolation is the rise of cooperation among countries in the global South. Historically marginalized by the Western-dominated international order, these countries are now forging new alliances and trade agreements that bypass the West altogether. For example, the African Continental Free Trade Area, or AFCFTA, is the largest free trade agreement in the world by the number of participating countries, offering African nations a platform for economic integration that does not rely on Western markets. Similarly, Latin American countries are increasingly looking to China and other non-Western powers for trade and investment, reducing their dependence on the United States. This growing South-South cooperation is reshaping global trade and investment patterns, leaving the West increasingly sidelined. The Western narrative of being the indispensable leader of the global economy is becoming less and less relevant as new trade routes, such as China's Belt and Road Initiative, connect emerging economies in Asia, Africa, and Latin America in ways that exclude Western influence. The consequences of the West's growing isolation are profound and multifaceted. As the West becomes increasingly marginalized on the global stage, it faces significant political, economic, and social challenges that threaten to undermine its long-term stability. The most immediate consequence of the West's isolation is its declining influence in global affairs. The United States and Europe can no longer dictate terms to the rest of the world as they once did. The rise of alternative power centers means that the West must now compete for influence rather than assume it by default. For instance, the US once had the ability to impose its will on international organizations like the United Nations and the World Trade Organization. Today, these organizations are increasingly contested spaces where Western influence is diminishing. The growing assertiveness of China and Russia within the UN Security Council and other multilateral forums is a clear sign of this shift. In terms of military power, the West is also facing limitations. The failures in Afghanistan, Iraq, and Libya have tarnished the image of Western military interventions, while countries like Russia and China are modernizing their armed forces and developing new capabilities, including advanced missile systems and cyber warfare technologies. The days when Western military dominance could single-handedly shape global events are over. Western isolation is not just a global issue. It is also fueling political instability at home. The economic decline, rising inequality, and failed foreign policies of Western governments have led to a growing sense of disillusionment among their populations. In the United States, for example, political polarization has reached dangerous levels, with the country more divided than at any time since the Civil War. The rise of populist movements in Europe and the US reflects a widespread rejection of the political elites who have overseen decades of economic mismanagement and failed foreign interventions. Brexit, the election of Donald Trump, and the rise of far-right parties in Europe are all manifestations of this domestic backlash against the globalist policies of the Western establishment. As populist leaders challenge the status quo, the West faces the very real prospect of political fragmentation and internal instability. The institutions that have traditionally upheld the Western order, liberal democracies, free markets, and international cooperation, are increasingly under attack from within. The isolation of the West is also leading to the erosion of its economic power. As countries around the world bypass Western-dominated financial systems, the West's ability to impose its economic will is fading. The dollar, long the bedrock of the global financial system, is slowly losing its status as the world's reserve currency as more countries trade in local currencies and build alternative financial systems. At the same time, Western economies are becoming less competitive on the global stage. high labor costs, excessive regulation, and a declining industrial base are making it harder for Western countries to compete with rising economies in Asia and beyond. The West's reliance on financial services and technology sectors has left it vulnerable to economic downturns, while countries like China are rapidly advancing in industries such as manufacturing, artificial intelligence, and green technology. As the West loses its economic edge, its influence in global trade negotiations is waning. Countries in Asia, Africa, and Latin America are forming new trade agreements that exclude the United States and Europe, leaving the West increasingly irrelevant in the world's most dynamic markets. Finally, the West's isolation is leading to the fraying of its traditional alliances. NATO, the cornerstone of Western military power, is increasingly divided, with member states pursuing divergent policies on issues like defense spending, relations with Russia, and the role of the United States in European security. The recent withdrawal of US troops from Afghanistan without adequate consultation with NATO allies has further strained these relationships. The European Union, too, is facing internal challenges. The rise of nationalist and populist movements in countries like Hungary, Poland, and Italy is testing the EU's cohesion, while Brexit has left the bloc weakened and divided. The dream of a united Europe is fading as member states prioritize their national interests over collective action. Outside of Europe, the West's alliances in the Asia-Pacific region are also under strain. The US alliance with Japan, South Korea, and Australia is facing new challenges as these countries seek to balance their relationships with both Washington and Beijing. Meanwhile, the growing influence of China in the region is making it harder for the US to maintain its traditional dominance. The decline of the West is not inevitable, but reversing this trend will require significant changes in both domestic and foreign policy. The West must confront the realities of a multipolar world and adjust its strategies accordingly. First and foremost, the West needs to rethink its approach to sanctions and foreign policy. Sanctions have become a blunt instrument that often backfires, alienating potential allies and pushing countries into the arms of rivals like China and Russia. Rather than relying on punitive measures, the West should focus on diplomacy and engagement, recognizing that cooperation rather than coercion is the key to maintaining influence in a multipolar world. The West must also abandon its hubristic belief in the universality of its political and economic models. Countries around the world are developing their own systems of governance and economic development, and the West must learn to respect these differences rather than impose its own values by force. Domestically, the West needs to address the growing economic inequality that is fueling political instability. This means reforming tax systems to ensure that the wealthy pay their fair share, investing in education and infrastructure, and rebuilding the manufacturing base that has been hollowed out by decades of outsourcing. The West must also confront the challenge of climate change, not only through green energy initiatives, but by ensuring that the transition to a low-carbon economy does not exacerbate existing inequalities. A just transition is essential to maintaining social cohesion and preventing further political fragmentation. Finally, the West must rebuild trust in its democratic institutions. This means addressing the corruption, inequality, and lack of accountability that have undermined public confidence in the political system. Populist movements have thrived because they offer an alternative to the status quo. But real reform is needed to address the underlying grievances that fuel these movements. The West's decline is not irreversible, but it will require a fundamental reassessment of its role in the world and a commitment to addressing the economic, political, and social challenges that have led to its current isolation. Only by adapting to the realities of a changing world can the West hope to regain its place as a leader in global affairs. In conclusion, the West, particularly the United States and Western Europe, is facing an unprecedented challenge to its hegemony. The collapsing Western economies, ineffective sanctions, and growing isolation from the rest of the world are symptomatic of deeper structural issues that have gone unaddressed for too long. The rise of alternative power centers in Asia, Africa, and Latin America, coupled with the West's internal political and economic crises, is leading to a rapid erosion of Western influence on the global stage. As the world moves towards a more multipolar order, the West must abandon its outdated belief in its own superiority and learn to engage with the rest of the world on equal terms. Only by doing so can the West hope to remain relevant in an increasingly interconnected and interdependent world. Failure to adapt will only accelerate its decline, making it the laughingstock for all.